Yeah.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Today I'm talking with Brandon Tozo. He's a professor of political science at Trent University with a focus on American politics for his research. Brandon is joining me today to talk about the Democratic primary, what that means going into the American general election, as well as some of the links between Canadian and American politics. So, Brandon, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Christo.
Thanks. So, I just want to start with a general question. You know, we've now gotten a sense of what the Democratic field is like. We're still at almost 20 people, but we've had two rounds of debates. Policies have started to come out. You know, rivalries have formed, alliances have formed in some ways. So I want to know what your take is at this stage. Who do you feel has underperformed, or who do you feel has overperformed relative to expectations? Like, what do you feel in that general sense?
So, I mean, the people who have overperformed that really stand out to me are Elizabeth Warren, who I think a month or two ago would have been viewed as being really kind of underperforming and not doing particularly well. But she's lately come in second in a lot of polls, which is quite impressive. She has released a lot of really interesting policies. And it seems the momentum is really with Warren. We are seeing the field kind of consolidate into a centrist and center left, like we did in 2016, with Biden being the obvious center candidate. And it seems Warren kind of taking that center left position. Biden, I don't think, has performed particularly well, but his polling seems pretty solid. He's maintained about a 10-point lead. There's been some dips after the first debate, but it's bounced back. And he's sort of the candidate to beat at this point. And it's early days yet. People often forget that the race doesn't really start to figure it out until after Iowa and New Hampshire in February of 2020, which is still quite a few months away. Another candidate I think that has done so Bourne has done pretty well. Buttigieg has gotten quite well as far as getting media and money and some attention. That hasn't translated so much in the polling. I think as far as underperforming, Kamala Harris, I kind of expected to do a bit better. She's got quite a profile, and just based on sort of demographics, she's not doing as well as I expected. But again, she's probably the second choice of a lot of Biden voters, and probably most voters, other than perhaps Bernie and Elizabeth Warren voters. And I'm going to be honest, I think Bernie has kind of underperformed. He was pretty well toe to toe with Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I kind of expected him to consolidate the center left base of the party around him instead of Elizabeth Warren, but they seem to be either dividing it or she's kind of overtaking them in some of the early states, which I found quite surprising. I think now that the field's more robust, we're getting a lot more competition for good ideas. And I think at this point, and again, early days yet, but I'm quite surprised that Bernie has not yet consolidated that. He's done well, don't get me wrong. He's second in some states, but he's dipping into third behind Warren, which I think surprised me.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the aggregates, his lead in second is still fairly comfortable, but you're right that Warren is sort of rising up a little bit. Sort of on that. So you see Biden as the favorite. I don't think that's an unreasonable point of view, but I'm always interested in this because there are some people who are running to be president, and I would say six or maybe seven of the candidates can be counted in there.
Yeah.
And the rest of them have no realistic shot. But among the also rans, who are you impressed with the most? Like from a policy perspective or a performance perspective, who of the really small candidates has been impressing you the most?
Well, I mean, like there are certain quirky candidates. Like, I mean, Marianne Williamson has been just entertaining on a purely spectacle kind of way, and people might dismiss that, but people said the same thing about Donald Trump, 4 years ago, that he was running as a spectacle. So it is kind of interesting. And talking about one issue that I thought she was really interesting was with Black people providing some form of redistribution.
Yes,
Yeah,
reparations.
reparations. Thank you, reparations from slavery, which is an issue that is not brought up a lot in the United States, but it is an issue that I think it would be interesting to have interjected into the Democratic primary base, because it's something that we kind of makes sense in a lot of ways. The U.S. system was based off of a lot of labor and a lot of slave power, but they never really got economic reconciliation from that. So it might seem like an outlandish candidate, but it's an interesting idea. Medicare for all, I think, is a really interesting idea that has come up and we've seen Bernie talk about it, and candidates have really kind of weighed in one way or the other of if they support it or not, or making Medicare not have a sort of age limit is another thing.
Yeah.
Aspect of it. So that's an interesting idea that I'd like to see interjected in the American political dialogue, and that's coming from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I think that we're getting a lot more political diversity and policy diversity in this versus the last time, where Hillary would have a position and Bernie would have another one. We're getting a lot of really interesting, quite eclectic ideas. So it's been a very interesting race for policy, and I think we'll get more of it as we get closer to Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think one of the things I've talked about on this channel is that, like, Bernie Sanders is in every debate because it's always like, are you opposed to Bernie's vision or are you in support of it? He's always there. So I guess my next point, and I guess you kind of answered it, you do feel there's a lot of relevant policy debates. Do you feel like the questions being asked at the debates and the questions being asked by the candidates, do you feel like they're actually capturing what Americans care about, like both Democrats but also the broader electorate, or do you think that they're not getting to the issues that real, quote unquote, real people care about?
Well, I think they're getting the issues that people in the Democratic primary care about, which may not be necessarily a good litmus test of where the average American voters would be. But I think the debates have been pretty fair. I think they're going to get better, to be honest. I think when the field narrows down to it's about 7 now, we're going to get a lot more interesting debates and people being able to square off of each other that weren't able to do so before, and more people be holding their feet to the fire and more contrasts. So, I mean, when you have a debate with 10 candidates, there's only so much you can really talk about, and everybody has their talking points. So I think they've been not bad so far, but I think they're going to be a lot better as we go into the fall and as we get closer. So I'm not unimpressed with the debates, but I think that it really does tell that we're really in early days yet.
No, I think you're right, and I think with these debates, they're even very uneven. The last round, you had Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, and then you also had Buttigieg and O'Rourke, all candidates in and around the 10-point threshold. Those are the candidates that have something of a realistic shot. Even O'Rourke in there is sort of maybe a bit of an outsider, but in the Harris Biden debate, you had Biden and Harris as the only candidates polling above 5%.
Yeah.
And so even Cory Booker's polling at, around 4 or 5%. You have these debates where you have one or two candidates that actually have a shot at winning this thing. And in some cases, 7 or 8 people who are vying for, a governorship or vying for a Senate seat or vying for a cabinet or a VP, nod. And so, yeah, I think you're right. Once we get down to, say, the final 8 or 9, you might have 1 or 2 smaller candidates left, but you're going to have all the big dogs on stage. I think that's going to make a big difference. And I think that's going to be a much greater test for the state of the field. So sort of on this note, because one of the arguments I've been hearing, this is something I want to pick your brain on. One of the arguments I've been hearing from a lot of people is that, the Democrats shouldn't be fighting one another because if they fight one another, they're only going to help Donald Trump, and they need to be unified now and after the primary. But, I mean, is that true? Because the Republican primary that ended with Trump as a winner was a real, like, slobber knocker. Like, the personal insults, like, all of these things, like Donald Trump just destroying his opponents in very personal terms, and vice versa, right? Like Donald Trump being attacked by a lot of Republicans, and yet they won the House and the Senate and the presidency and the Supreme Court. So I'm wondering, do you feel like the Democrats need to be civil now, or do you feel like these like passionate debates are a good thing right now at this stage?
Well, I think oddly enough, when you take a look at because the comparison is incumbent presidents who've lost, which is really what we should be looking at for historical comparisons. And those type of debates don't really hurt the party that's trying to take down the incumbent. They're kind of healthy. I think of Jimmy Carter and Jimmy Carter's reelection in 1980. Like there was a robust conflict between, say, like the moderate wing of the Republican Party and Reagan. So George H.W. Bush. That was really divisive. Like he called it voodoo economics, and Reagan ended up winning and taking down Jimmy Carter by a landslide.
Yeah.
Even the Democratic field where Jimmy Carter took down Gerald Ford, that was a very robust debate where Jimmy Carter won. Big discussion of like where the party was going. These debates, they can be, but they not necessarily. What I think is more interesting is the type of who's going to come out of the woodwork fighting against Trump, the internal debates within the Republican Party. I think if they're unified and if we don't get a sort of Republican challenging him reasonably in the primaries, it might be easier, harder to take him down, as opposed to this diversity of political ideas that are coming out in this debate. Because I don't think at the end of the day, when once we get past Super Tuesday and we'll get an idea of where the field is, and then they really do have quite a bit of time to repair the party before then. I don't think that this kind of diversity, I think it's actually a sign of healthiness within the Democratic Party. I was actually really worried for, in 2016 when there was only really two candidates. To me, that's not a sign of a healthy party. If there's only, a centrist candidate and a center-left candidate, this is much more a sign of a robust Democratic Party. And I think that it shows some of the health that we'll have going forward.
No, I think you're right. I think it gives, we can mock, John Delaney and Hickenlooper and all these, effectively these would have been Republicans 10 years ago, 20 years ago types. Like, we can mock these people, but you're right. There's a diversity of thought. There's a diversity of people in the Democratic primary, and I think voters are better off for it. I think you're right. We do need to cut the fat here and get down to the 6 to 10 best candidates. But I think this 20-person process at the beginning, at least, has actually been quite helpful. So
and sorry, just to add to that, we wouldn't have had Buttigieg if we just looked at the top contenders. He kind of came out of nowhere, and he's interjected maybe not ideas I agree with, but a really interesting perspective and brought a lot of sort of enthusiasm to the race. I don't think he's going to be president. He might be a VP pick. Just based on some of his demographics, and he might be a moderate bend to the ticket, but I'm glad he's there. I don't agree with him. And Biden, who's somebody who I'm not a huge fan of, he's brought a lot of policy discussion and a lot of sort of the Democratic Party revisiting some of its early root in the 70s and 80s, which I think needs to be done for the party to emerge as a progressive force this election. So not all candidates are going to win, but some candidates, it's I think always better in presidential races to have more people at the table to bring ideas forward, because I think that adds a lot more political diversity in the process.
Yeah, no. So I this question's a bit. So as Brandon's an Americanist in terms of his studies and his research and his teaching. He primarily teaches about American politics, kind of in the post-war, post 1940s era, but. Brandon's a Canadian, and he's a political of Canadian politics too. So I think he's in somewhat of a unique position to ask, being a Canadian who studies America, what's the weirdest thing about the American political system from your perspective? The oddest thing, that from your perspective.
So many things. So there's so much political differences that I don't kind of realize it until I'm in the States. I would say. Vehement debates about abortion. I'm going to kind of throw that out there as being one of the things that they is quite angry and emotional and politicized in the United States. And we certainly do have a pro-life movement in Canada, but it doesn't have the same political leverage as it does in the United States. So whenever I sort of go to the United States and do research down there and interview Republicans, I sort of have to grid myself that there's going to be a lot of pro-life as just sort of being the litmus test for why you're a Republican, where I don't think you'd get any conservative. They might say I'm pro-life, but I don't care about it as a policy, or don't really want to implement it in Canada, where in the United States, it's like, of course I'm pro-life and I want to overturn Roe v. Wade. What else would I be in politics for? That it takes me aback quite some time, and some very kind of old-fashioned views of where women should be in the household, like women should be in the house raising children. We don't get that in Canada. It's just not in our political system. Guns are another thing. Having sort of even most Democrats be not in favor of robust gun control is something that you wouldn't get. We have a pretty broad consensus. There might be some discussions among our political parties, but there's a very, not even Democrats really want to touch the gun control debate, which to me is just intuitive. The more guns you have, the more gun violence you're going to have. And the data is fairly robust to back that up. That is one of the things. And I think one thing that is the role of government as always being skeptical. In Canada, we look to the government across the political spectrum to solve problems or interject in with social issues, and
Yeah.
there's deep skepticism of the role of government across the political spectrum. Democrats always seem like they have to justify the role of government, and like it's an outlandish thing. Like, yes, the government can do this a bit better. Where Canadians are like, of course the government can do healthcare better.
Yeah.
It does it well. Of course the government can provide like adequate public education. It does a good job of it. Where I always feel like the Democrats are a bit more. They have to explain why it does. There's not this intuitive sense where government has a positive role in people's lives. So those are the main political differences that I've noticed between Canada and the United States. And maybe we can get into more of the polarization that's going on there and that later on. But yeah, I think that's something I always have to sort of prepare myself for whenever I go to the United States. That these big polarized issues don't exist as much in Canada. We have our own set of issues, but I find in the United States there's far more differences and things that are not issues here are much more significant issues there.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some great points. I mean, I think that you're right in it, and I mean, certainly we could talk about the hypocrisy of the of both of the Republicans, especially, but even the Democrats, and saying they don't want government intervention when the how many military companies are effectively wings of the state apparatus, and we could talk a lot about that. But in Canada, I think you're right in noting that all of our political parties at one time or another have saw the direct connection between like the state and building up of industry and things like that, whether it's the national policy under Sir John A. Macdonald or, the CCF NDP has always been the party of planning, or even the Liberal Party has talked about, the National Energy Program was under the Liberals. There's been these systems from all three parties. I think that's a great point. Sort of on this note, last week I talked a bit about this on my channel about how in Canada, I think one of our limitations is that we look to the USA and we see, how dysfunctional it is and how lax their social programs are, and we often, use that as an excuse to rest on our laurels. And I'm wondering if you see that and if you agree with that. Like, Canada always compares its healthcare to, say, the United States, but never to Norway or Finland or Sweden. Or Canada compares its university costs to the private universities like Harvard, but never to the free tuition universities of Western Europe. And I'm wondering if you've seen this, again, as somebody who studies the USA, but as a Canadian, and I want to know of your perspective.
Yeah, we tend to view ourselves as being non-American, and a lot
Yeah.
of our identity is based on, well, we're not like this like the Americans, and we're not like this like the Americans. But I will say that I think I would give Canadians maybe perhaps more credit based on my travels. That I think that we do have a fairly robust political. I disagree with you there. I think that we have a fairly robust political discussion of what we need to do to improve and what we need to do better. Um, I, I think that there are some, I think in areas of healthcare or in areas of increasing social programs, but this is going to sound, but we have a broader and more, I think, institutionalized center left in Canada. We have a more robust labor movement that drives these issues, where the U.S. labor movement has been gutted. They have a much weaker labor movement in by almost any measures, and certainly as far as political leverage is concerned. So I think Canadians, sort of as a general population, are pretty do what you're saying. But as far as driving the agenda home, I think Canadians actually have a very robust political debates about like how we want to improve healthcare, and right now how we want to, if we want to include a Medicare program. That's being driven by the labor movement. That's being driven by the NDP and to a lesser extent the Liberals. So I don't know. I don't think Canadians rest on their laurels as much as we might think we do. I think that we actually do. We're just, I think, more incremental about it. I think Americans expect a lot to be done in a short period of time. I think Canadians are really kind of okay with like slow, incremental, increasing government intervention, where that might be mistaken for agreement of the status quo and just comparing ourselves. Oh, we're left wing enough. We have enough of a social program. I think we're more just like, okay, the government will get around to these things eventually. And that I think I would say Canadians are a little bit more politically lazy than Americans.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I don't know if I fully agree because, over since the 1990s, we might not have lost all of our social programs, but there hasn't really been any progress. I mean, the whole issue with Canadian politics is like, when's the last social program that's been created federally? Like, when's the last major social program that's been created on the level of a child care or pharmacare or dental care? And I mean, you have to go back to the 60s, I think, right? Like, there's no free tuition. So I think Canadians maybe have a broader understanding of what needs to be done. But I mean, I personally think if they have the will to do something, they certainly haven't. And I think like that's the issue. And I think that's where the American issue comes in. I think if you poll Canadians on do you support a pharmacare system, it'll probably be more successful in Canada than the US. But I mean, Bernie Sanders is offering a vision of Medicare that no liberal has ever offered, and that the NDP has only recently started offering again after kind of moved to the center. So I think Bernie Sanders is great because he shatters that notion that there's no left-wing politicians in the US that are like Canadian progressives. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it develops, because if Bernie Sanders is successful, Canada will have the worst healthcare program in the industrialized world if Bernie wins, because Bernie's plan is bigger than ours and better than ours. It's very similar to Jagmeet Singh in the NDP's plan. So that's something I'm interested to see what happens. So, of course.
I could respond to that. I think one thing to keep in mind in Canada, and this is just a political reality, is I think federal politicians have been less willing to lead with national policies. This is not a comment on whether they should or shouldn't. I think that they just haven't, because they tend to leave it up to the provinces, because regionalism has been such a divisive issue in Canadian politics. I would prefer a national pharmacare program. I'd prefer these things. I think federal politicians are more just like, we'll leave it to a province. If they want to do it, that's fine. And we have seen some political movements of it's not consistent, but lower daycare in Quebec and like OHIP Plus in Ontario. So we are seeing some of that. Like a carbon tax or a cap and trade in BC, where I think in the United States, this is the odd part of the United States, is the federal government has it started as a weak federation, but the federal government, when you can get Congress to agree on anything, which is rare, actually has a huge ton of power. Like, they can introduce a national program and you just get it through, like Obamacare, and you get it through Congress and you got it. In Canada, there's a lot more, it seems, trade-offs, and I think federal governments across the political spectrum have just become reluctant in Canada. And you know more about Canadian politics, and maybe I'm off base on this, but I think they are just reluctant to do a national program for fear of angering some of the provinces. There seems to be more of just laissez-faire and let the provinces decide what they want to do. And we are sort of seeing that with the carbon tax, is we're saying a national policy. And I have criticisms of Trudeau's carbon tax, and we're seeing a lot of the provinces now fight back against it. And it's an open-ended question of whether that will be successful. Where in the United States, you could really implement a national program, and the national government would certainly might be able to implement it. You get states fighting against it, of course, and you get fights in Congress, and it'd be taken up to the Supreme Court. But I think that intuitive regionalism in Canada has really overlaid itself more in our national politicians in the past 30 years. So that might be an explanation of why we haven't had huge national programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a reasonable one. I mean, my view is ultimately that it's the liberals and conservatives don't want to do it, and so you have the eternal passing of the buck between jurisdictions. Cities say we can't do it; it's the province. Province says we can't do it; it's the federals. Federal will say, well, we can't do it; it's the cities and the provinces.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very convenient excuse. But I think you make a good point. There are certain sorts of reforms that are easier to pass in the U.S. than Canada because of that divide. I mean, for instance, we talk about labor reform, but in Canada, it's very hard to pass labor reform at the federal level. It only applies to federally mandated workers. Yet Bernie Sanders, for instance, is talking about a national ban of right to work. And if he can get the votes, of course, that's a big question. But if he can get the votes, Bernie Sanders could effectively end right to work in all 50 states as president. And he has that power because of the ability of the federal labor code, which applies to federal and which applies to all workers in the states in a way that it doesn't in Canada. So you're right, there are some major differences in the division of powers. In some ways, the American states have more powers by default. the devolution of powers defaults to the states. In Canada, it's the opposite. But where the provinces have powers in Canada, I think they're more well defined. I think that's a great point. So kind of getting back to the primary, just to kind of close this out in the next few questions, if you had to pick one policy, be it in Canada because we don't have it, or just if you're like an American and you want to see it, what's one policy you're hearing about in the Democratic primary? You had to implement it. If you could, which one would it be?
So for that I'd implement in the United States?
Yeah. So you're watching these primaries, you're hearing all the policies from Warren and Sanders and Biden and everybody else. It's like that's the one I think that they should implement. Like day one, Democratic president has the legislative block to do it. What would be the first thing they should do?
I'd probably say a Medicare for all would be a very straightforward, very implementable. There's enough of a tax base. There's a lot I like a wealth tax, something that I'd love to see instituted in the United States. I would certainly like to see like Black people have some form of reparations for slavery. That would be probably more outlandish and less practically implemented. But yeah, I mean, as a Canadian who has appreciated our healthcare system, I would say Medicare for all. Medical bankruptcies are still the number one cause of bankruptcies in the United States, even with Obamacare. The individual mandate has largely been gutted. And the Obamacare program, I mean, it was largely, and people tend to look on it rather romantically, but it was largely there to help insurance companies. And the premiums that people had to pay was astronomical. And a Medicare for all that would have a good tax base would just resolve so many of those issues. And especially it would help people who are poor and middle class. It would help across the spectrum, where a lot of the other things and environmental policy, getting back in the Paris Accords, would certainly be, or not leaving them because there's a 5-year or 4-year window where they could stay in, would certainly be something that they would do. But as far as a straight one policy that I think would affect most lives of Americans, I would certainly say Medicare for all.
I mean, yeah, that would be my inkling. I think you raised some other good ones, but I think that's the best one. And sort of kind of as a final question, I'm interested to see your take because you talked about Warren maybe being a rising candidate and all these things. But, there's been a lot of polling done to suggest, well, in a hypothetical matchup, Trump versus this Democrat, who comes out best? And the polling has indicated that Sanders and Biden are kind of the clear frontrunners. A poll indicates that both Sanders and Biden would beat Trump in Texas. But I'm wondering, do you feel that's accurate? Who do you think is, the most likely to beat Trump, whether you like them the most or not? Like this is the gal or this is the guy that's going to beat Trump in 2020. Who do you think that is?
I'm going to be controversial, and I think Trump's going to get reelected. So I'm going to throw that out right there. Just to.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong, but yeah, no, but like, I mean, I think he's in more trouble than the average second-term president. I think that think
close. I think I think each candidate has their pros and cons. They sort of hit well with a certain demographic, and they are bad among others. So I don't think that there's a clear and concise, like if Bernie won, he would probably do better in Wisconsin and the traditional Rust Belt states, but he might lose out in New Mexico and Arizona and other areas in Florida that he might not poll as well in. I don't think those Texas polls are accurate. Texas is still a very red state. And I think that there's a lot of it's going to have to do with the economy and positions of the time. Getting rid of an incumbent president is very challenging. Incumbent presidents don't tend to lose, which is a very, very kind of bad historical record for those who want to take him out. So the stars do really have to align. But I think that I was looking at sort of polling head to head, and it's very early. It's very difficult. There are some inbuilt advantages the Democrats have. Michigan, they're polling. Trump's negatives are very high in Pennsylvania. They're very high in Wisconsin. They're very high throughout the United States. But on a head-to-head, I think Biden would do well in certain states. I think Bernie would do well in other states. I think Kamala Harris would be able to get the black vote. Here's something very interesting that I want you to consider: is in most states that Trump won, it wasn't because he got a bunch of people out. He did in Pennsylvania, but he didn't in Michigan. He didn't get a lot of new voters out in Wisconsin. He didn't get a lot of new voters out. It's just the Democrats didn't get their base out.
Yeah.
People were not, and I was on the ground. I was in Ohio on election day, and the Democratic Party had buses of people to take them to the polls, and they wouldn't go. And the Republicans lined up. People who liked Trump lined up to vote for him. They didn't have to. The Republican Party did not have to get those people out to vote for Trump. Enthusiasm matters a lot. So I would say to the Democrats is, I think Biden is the safe choice for a lot of Democrats looking at polls, but I don't think he's the best choice. I think that getting your base that's really enthusiastic, whoever that candidate is, and getting somebody passionate matters a lot. And I think that passion was there behind Trump, and it really wasn't there behind Hillary. Having that on election day, I think, is worth more than looking at where polling is right now.
I mean, I think that's a great point. And, in a context of a country where 95% of people turned out, then I think it makes perfect sense to focus all your strategy on how do you flip the other guy's voters, right? But in the U.S., I think you're very, it's perceptive to note that, the Democrats could win without flipping very many Trump voters at all. In fact, they could win without flipping a single Trump voter if they can raise turnout sufficiently. If they can get Obama 2008 levels of turnout, then it's game over for Trump, right? It's over, right? I mean, you might not see them win another supermajority in the Senate. You might need to see, them flip some voters in that case, but it's game over for Trump, and the House remains Democratic, and they probably edge the Senate. And that's why I think, yeah, you're right. Biden is the candidate tailor-made to flip moderate Republicans, but I don't know if that's how you win. And I think you're right. Maybe picking somebody who can energize the African-American vote is vital. I think someone like Bernie Sanders who can energize young people is vital. I mean, Justin Trudeau won his majority because he got Indigenous people and young people out to the polls. Whether we knew Justin Trudeau was lying to them, we knew that. We knew that, but they didn't know that. They went out to the polls in earnest. Jeremy Corbyn, the reason why that slam dunk British election turned out to be a big gain for Labour was because they underestimated youth turnout. And so I think you're right in noting that energization of the base is vital. And so these polls have value. I think it does say something that Bernie and Biden, I think consistently in these polls, are the most likely to beat Trump, but that doesn't include energization, I don't think. I think one thing about Texas is I would agree with you. I don't think it's quite as close as, the Democrats being up 4. But, Beto O'Rourke did almost beat Ted Cruz, and Texas is becoming much more diverse. And one thing apparently a lot of people have been noting in Texas is there's a lot of congressmen in Texas not running again. And, even if you're disgusted with Trump, you might vote for your down ballot guy or girl. But if they're not there anymore, I wonder if you see a depressed Republican turnout in areas where they're not happy with Trump and there's no big name incumbent that you're loyal to. And some people are saying that it could affect the down ballots. And there's even some talk about, some states not putting Trump on the ballot because he's not filing his tax returns. And those are states that Trump would lose anyway. But if Trump's name isn't on the ballot, does a Trump Republican come out to vote for Joe No Name with an R next to it? These are all discussions I don't think we know the full answer to yet. So Brandon, go ahead.
Sorry, I would just say that I think that people said the same thing in 2016, and they still got out to vote and voted Republican. I think that might be different in Canada versus the United States. Is most Canadians, I would say, are pretty squishy when it comes to where they vote. Maybe not people like you and me who have pretty solid party identification, and people who are really party activists. But a lot of people in Canada tend to veer between different parties. Like I might vote NDP this time, or I might vote Green, or I might vote Liberal. Certainly among the center left, and even among the Liberals and the Conservatives, there's a lot of people who will switch between those two.
And Conservatives and New Democrats. I mean, as in certain cities. I mean, the NDP is the second choice of every party according to Abacus.
But people also vote for their second choice. In the United States, One thing I've noticed is there's not a lot of people who will switch from the Republicans to the Democrats. Like it's an identity thing, and it's really built in. Like once you're a Republican, you're a Republican for life. Once you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat for life. And that ability to switch, and this is where demographics are important, and I think highlighting Texas is it won't be because Republicans suddenly go, "Oh, I'm a Democrat." It will be
No.
because there's more Hispanic voters who would have identified for a long period of time. Um,
Well,
so
and a new class of workers, a new kind of a new middle class of tech workers in places like Austin and stuff, which have different ideological leanings. It's more of a California, a slice of California and Texas that's going to, I think, have an effect too.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
again, this is where I think getting a base of your voter out is probably easier, and identifying those,
Yeah.
uh, and more than sort of convincing voters for the other side that you're going to. I've dealt with a lot of Trump supporters in my time in the United States, and I can't convince them to switch their like it's just not it's I can't win that argument getting them to sort of switch to being a Democrat. The party identification, party loyalty in the United States is really ingrained. So getting states to switch and people to switch, I really think you really have to nominate a passionate candidate who will get people out to vote, who's their base, and who gets
Yeah.
new votes out. I agree with you 100% there.
Well, there's only one Democrat that's filling Stadia, and we know who that is. So, Brandon, thanks again for joining. Great to have you here. Thanks for being my first interview. I'll be doing
Yeah,
more of these, folks. I'm gonna try to line up some interviews with experts and with politicians and just interesting folks. So Brandon's the first one. Of course, we'd be glad to have him back at some point. Brandon, where can people find you on the internet?
you can follow me on Twitter. It's at Brandon Tozo, and I'm helping out Tom Parkin with Game Changers, which is a new social media network that's there to promote left wing and progressive issues leading up to the 2019 election. So, and you can find me teaching at Trent University.
Excellent. Brandon, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Christo.